Well, hi there, class. It is I once again, and hope you're doing well. This is actually being recorded on Sunday evening, the 19th, but you'll be watching it for tomorrow's class session, which is on Monday, the 20th. So we're entering our last week of classes, and just a couple of things to be aware of. So I've been posting for all my different classes a lot of stuff to do with the end of the semester, and I think you're probably all up to speed on this, but remember that the final exam is coming up in now about what, 10 days, I guess. So you guys are gonna have to be prepping for that. And I've already posted the final exam study suggestions on the Converge page. So you can access those and start going through them. As far as the layout for the final, it'll be basically what you just went through a couple of weeks ago with exam 2, a few weeks back. One thing that I will remind you of, I'm going to post this when you guys do submit those. I'm going to make sure that you understand you need to submit those back to me as either Microsoft Word documents or as PDFs. Either one of those will work just fine. But I do not want you taking pictures of the exam and sending it to me. Some of you resorted to that, maybe out of desperation, I'm not sure, but you need to either send it back to me as a Microsoft Word document or as a PDF. The PDF works just fine. So again, I'll be reminding you of that particular detail when I post the rules about the exam, but just something to keep in mind now and just make life easier on me as I'm going through all these assignments that are coming in these days. Okay, so our task today is to talk about the 1980s, and I'm wrapping this into one Zoom lecture. Still not used to calling anything a Zoom whatever, but yes, one Zoom lecture, so that we're going to have a little more time to deal with the 90s and 2000s and on into the 2010s here. So let's jump into a couple of things about the 1980s. First and foremost, so I suppose at some level the 1980s are a little more near and dear to my heart because I lived through them as a junior higher and high schooler and freshman in college. So actually, I think I have. Let me see. There we go. So if you're looking for a good laugh, I've just given it to you. So congratulations, Merry Christmas early. I'm not really sure what else to say. Once upon a time, that rascal on the screen was me. You see me upper left corner and upper right corner, and then on the picture below, that's me with my dad all the way back in I believe 1989, if memory serves. So yeah, so I somehow lived through and survived the 1980s, which was probably probably a little more challenging than you might believe. Just from a fashion sense and a hairstyle sense, the 1980s were rather cruel, even to young guys. So nobody now really likes to think about the mullets from the late 80s and early 1990s if they're a guy, and certainly a lot of the other outrageous stuff that's going on in the 1980s, whether it's music or movies or hairstyles or clothing choices. I can tell you that to this day, I'm very grateful that my father, who is my parents both, but especially my dad, was kind of put his foot down, and I did not own a pair of parachute pants, which is probably a really good thing. So I'm at the time I thought, that's a horrible travesty that I'm not allowed to go and buy and wear parachute pants, but nonetheless, I'm very grateful at this point in life that there are no pictures of me with said piece of clothing on my body. So pop culture in the 1980s, something to be aware of. The trend, the craze that became music television kicked off in the 1980s. So it wasn't just listening to the LPs that we all used to have and the cassette tapes, but also the the trend of watching music videos. That began in the 1980s. All sorts of famous groups there. Obviously, Michael Jackson, one of the more famous albums of all time, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Groups like Huey Lewis, Van Halen, U2, one of my personal favorites. Actually, I was intrigued by U2 from a very young age, so started listening to them when I was in the 5th grade, and have never stopped, to be honest with you. So it's one of the holdover bands that I still very much love listening to. Lower left corner, Madonna in her infamous garb from the Like a Virgin years, one of the more outrageous and stupid songs of the 1980s. So these elements of 1980s culture certainly would be measuring posts for a lot of people as they thought back to the decade. All sorts of pop culture from the 80s, beyond the musical realm, a lot of movies, a lot of famous movies and television shows and games. So you got the Rubik's Cube and the onset of video game culture. So Pac-Man, famously one of the great games of all time. TV shows like Miami Vice that came out in 1984, which even to this day, when I see clips of that show, I keep thinking to myself, why is it that the lead character, Sonny Crockett, is comfortable wandering around the streets of Miami wearing his pajamas? But that, be that as it may, it was a very popular television show. Got a very young Tom Selleck with his infamous stash there as Magnum PI. Some great movies from the 1980s, Darth Vader informing everyone, shocking everyone with the critical information that he was in fact Luke Skywalker's father. This happened in The Empire Strikes Back, Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Top Gun. These are all famous films from the 1980s. So 1980s pop culture extraordinaire, really a key feature. And one of the points I want to make here is actually the title. One of the key features of the decade that I want to hone in on is the rampant, kind of the unleashing of American materialism on the world, which was, it's not as if American materialism in pop culture hadn't featured before, but the 1980s just saw this unbridled, release and broadcasting of American pop culture in ways that many hadn't really quite seen before, at least not to that extent. And that's, that's very purposeful in a number of ways, and that I'm going to get to that in a few minutes, because it also relates to, the Americanizing of global culture, which has some consequences even relating to something like the Cold War. So that's where we're going in a few minutes. But, this is a thoroughly materialistic orientation. Consumerism, certainly that this is not the first decade where American consumerism has featured heavily. We know this, even as we think about, the 1920s, for instance, which we have talked about. But, it's the decade when so much of the consumer culture seems to have reached its height and, reached this level of attention with the marketing campaigns, with the availability of a lot of these new things. And because of the increased technologies and the availability of stuff like video games in particular, right? And the fact that instead of 1 or 2 or 3 television shows or television channels, more like, I guess, 5 or 6 television channels, ABC, CBS, NBC, maybe a local access channel of some kind, and 1 or 2 others. Instead of those television channels being the extent of your television watching opportunities at your home, in the 1980s, American audiences were introduced to the very interesting realities of cable television, where it was more like, 50 or 60 channels of opportunity, maybe more like 40 actually, but still, 30 to 40 channels, and home box office, right? HBO is introduced, and people are watching a lot more at home than they ever had before. The release of movies on video, right, which was a new thing in the 1980s. So it wasn't just your opportunity to go and watch things in the theaters. You were able to then have them on a cassette tape and watch them at home on your VCR. All of these things are just symbols really of how expansive 1980s pop culture really was, and no home was free from it. So the marketing schemes, the advertising executives just dug in even deeper to try to make sure that the American material culture was infiltrating just about every aspect of our lives. And they did a phenomenal job as far as being successful with it, because I'm certainly a product of that. Many of my friends, of course, would say the same thing. We peppered our poor parents with all sorts of requests left and right. We were like every red-blooded American kid at that point, with all the stuff that was coming down the pike. And so this rampant materialism of the 1980s is a critical component. And it's particularly tough for Christian households, by the way. I want to just mention that in passing as well. As we're learning biblically and scripturally approaches to what idols look like in our lives, what those idols can be. And of course, as teenagers, as junior hires and high schoolers, we're being inundated with this rampant materialism and succumbing to the various idols in our culture, whether it was video games or movies or television or all the crazy clothes or all the rest. Just really that stuff really hits you right between the eyes. There's also the material culture is joined at the hip with a lot of other hedonistic components of the culture that may have been kind of sitting on the fringes. These weren't advertised as clearly as they probably are now, actually. But the 1980s drug subculture was real, and particularly in parts of the country with more affluent members of society. So the upper middle class, the upper classes in America, they tended to have more access to drugs like cocaine in particular. It's kind of the white collar drug of the 1980s. And I can tell you just by personal experience that I had acquaintances and friends in the affluent suburb that I grew up in, Wheaton, just outside of Chicago. That stuff was readily available. I actually saw it on a number of different occasions, and had friends that were dealing with those issues. And so this pop culture of the 1980s, be it the material pop culture or the subcultures that were kind of linked to some of these issues, those are really important challenges that began to face middle-class Americans in ways that really hadn't quite come to the forefront, at least not on such an epic scale prior to that point in time. And I can tell you, a lot of churches had to start dealing with these realities a little bit more specifically. So, the modern church youth group in a number of different ways, I think, was really born in the 1980s. And it's obviously morphed over time. But, the whole approach of trying to help Christian teens to kind of make it through those years, if not unscathed, at least intact, and having still retained their faith in the midst of all this, this cultural onslaught, was really an interesting component of all this. So what a weird time, honestly. And I guess I'm grateful, going back to these pictures, I guess I'm grateful. Yeah, these are, I can get a chuckle out of them. I'm sure you're probably chuckling yourselves, but if I'm honest, I've seen way worse pictures of people from the 1980s, so I'm not going to be too worked up about it, I guess. So let's center in on a couple of key figures of the 1980s. Obviously, these pop culture icons are huge, and there are many more. These are tip of the iceberg kind of stuff, but you get the idea. The rampant materialism and hedonism of the 1980s certainly is featured heavily in all these different pop culture orientations. But we do have to grapple a little bit with American politics because of the ways in which Ronald Reagan's America, really, epitomized so much of what we see in the 1980s. So Ronald Reagan runs against Jimmy Carter in 1980. for the presidential election and wins, and actually surprised a lot of people. Even weeks before the election, Ronald Reagan was not given much of a chance to beat Carter, and he surprised a lot of people, sort of not identically, but similarly to what we saw in the 2016 election, where everyone just assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to run away with the presidential win in 2016, and that obviously did not happen. So Ronald Reagan, former actor in Hollywood, who, by the way, I hate the idea that I sometimes hear Ronald Reagan was just a B actor, only in B films, as opposed to being an A-lister with guys like Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn or whoever else in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s. He, like all those Hollywood actors, he did make some B films, but he was in a lot of really good ones. And if you check out his filmography, you'd probably be surprised to learn that you may have even seen a film or two. Probably my favorite film is when he plays George Gipp for Win One for the Gipper, right? One of the great football films of all time, old Ronald Reagan. He was in a lot of stupid films too, but what Hollywood actor or actress has not been in a bunch of stupid movies? He marries Nancy Davis after having a really difficult first marriage. He marries Nancy Davis, and he and Nancy were together for the rest of their lives. Reagan famously is governor of California for a time, and his activity, his commitment and his interest to American politics really began all the way back during his acting career. But he kind of uses that as a jumping point to catapult himself into the American political sphere, and he has some outrageous success, a lot of notoriety, and gains a lot of recognition as an emerging, very conservative voice in American politics, and a very capable one. The other thing I really don't like about the ways in which people sometimes reference Ronald Reagan is they seize upon the last year, the very last tail end of his presidency, when the Alzheimer's disease had already begun to set in and there were signs of memory failure and whatnot, just at the very tail end of his presidency. And there's this strange desire, I think, to pretend that was who Ronald Reagan really was, and that's just not true. Reagan was a very adept politician, a very clear thinker. He was a wonderful articulator, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that he's typically noted as the great communicator. So Reagan, perhaps drawing from his acting background, understood very well how to encapsulate arguments and how to make the case for policies to the American people. And similar to Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and some of his predecessors, Reagan took policies to the American people and went to the television screens and had a lot of communication with the American public through that medium. And he was very effective at it, as you might imagine. And this is one of the things that Reagan does very well in 1980 and moving through his presidency is he has an uncanny ability to retain a very positive, forward-thinking perspective and communicating that positive mentality to the American people. Now, I want you to understand something important as far as why this matters at all regarding Ronald Reagan in 1980. So the United States at that time, of course, was just coming off of first obviously the Carter presidency, but think back a little bit further and you realize prior to Carter, the American people had lived through the Vietnam War era, they lived through the Watergate scandal. The Carter years were not easy, both from an economic perspective for many Americans. There were a lot of foreign policy embarrassments, not the least of which was the Iran hostage crisis that finally ended when Reagan came to office. And many Americans just had kind of fallen into the belief that America's best days were behind it, and that all of the modern challenges of life, the Cold War scenarios, economic upheaval of the 60s and 70s, ongoing questions about wars like Vietnam. Really, a lot of these swirling questions were out there, and many Americans were just, kind of caught in that cycle of doom and gloom in a sense. And Reagan comes to the forefront, and one of his great campaign strategies was to talk about the fact that it was morning in America. It was not sunset, that it was the sunrise of America's present and future, that America was still very much a country on the make, a country on the rise, and that in fact America's best days were ahead of it. And this pumping of a very positive message really won him a lot of interest. And a lot of fence riders, right? A lot of people who were probably more moderate, weren't necessarily, right or left, conservative or liberal necessarily. They were intrigued by Reagan's message, and that ended up making the difference for him in that first election. And then in 1984, it was a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan at that point. So Reagan, as the president of the United States, is actually important to understand because his personality plays into that time period, I think, particularly well. He seemed, what better place than the 1980s to have the president of the United States be a former Hollywood actor? It seemed so fitting for many. That just seemed to be par for the course. So a couple of things about Reagan's policies. Look, I'm not going to walk you through every sequence of the presidency, but I do need you to be aware of some things. And the Yawp text does bring to the forefront Reagan's supply side economics. And I want you to understand what this is about. So make sure you go through the Yawp text as well and read that. But I'll just boil it down really as sort of a simplistic baseline for you. So one of the major concerns when Reagan came to office was that the American economy had been stagnating for some time. Part of that was due to a number of really asinine trade deals that had been put together by the Carter administration, and also not just trade deals, but cessation on trade during the Carter years with some really important parts of the world. So the Reagan government very early on decided to re-engage in a number of important trade deals with other countries, including, by the way, the Soviet Union and China, which had been reduced to kind of a trickle when it came to trade negotiations with the US by 1981. But also to kind of reinvest in the American entrepreneurial spirit, to try to give enough Americans who were entrepreneurial businessmen and those who were in corporate America as well, give them enough room to maneuver with some tax breaks, some really critical tax breaks, to allow both corporations but also individual Americans to reinvest that money in the economy itself, to give them more money to use to invest in the economy, to buy, to be very, there is a kind of a I don't know if you want to say it's a crass part of this or not, but it's certainly the American capitalistic zealous capitalistic orientation here. Make sure that Americans are in fact given the freedom and the money with greater amounts of disposable income to actually be bigger and better consumers. And the idea was that with the various features of what becomes known as supply side economics, the critics typically refer to it as Reaganomics. The idea was that in boosting the entrepreneurial openness and opportunity, in dropping tax rates as much as that was possible. It was actually a gradual drop over about a 3.5 to 4 year time period. And then encouraging these various forms of American investment in the economy. The idea was that the wealth was going to have what was referred to as a trickle-down effect, that Americans it was not just going to be the wealthiest of Americans, but even those in the middle classes and beyond and below, if you want to use it, that phrase, that Americans were going to be experiencing this increased access to wealth in all the various spheres. Now, middle-class Americans, by the way, the vast majority of middle-class Americans benefited enormously from supply-side economics. And it didn't happen right away. Actually, there were doubts by 1982 and 1983 about whether supply-side economics was actually even functioning and was actually going to work. But by 1984, it was, the American economy was roaring by comparison to what it had been. However, here's the catch. The catch comes from the fact that blue-collar Americans, working-class Americans, benefited far less than white-collar Americans, upper-middle-class Americans were benefiting from supply-side economics. It's not that working-class Americans did not benefit at all. They did, but their disposable income, their capacity to actually invest more heavily and to actually experience notable or noticeable change in their economic status, that was extremely limited for many in working class America. And so you're not surprised to learn, many Americans of the working classes were less than thrilled with Reagan's supply side economics. That is not true universally, but it had a tendency to be more true. So that is something I wanted you to be aware of, Reagan and his supply side economics. I put this this meme up there because the idea that wealth was going to trickle down. So there were a lot of critics then, and there remain critics now of Reaganomics. And one of the more reasonable critiques has always been, well, fine, there may have been some trickle down effect, but it really did not reach past the middle, the middle of the middle class and the upper echelons of the middle class. Therefore, many Americans did not really have access to the privilege that was intended. Okay, so Reaganomics, definitely something you need to be aware of. The other thing that you obviously really need to know is the Cold War comes to a screeching halt really beginning in 1989. Technically, the dissolving of the Soviet Union continues on through 1990 and in through 1991, and the transition into a new Russian government and a completely new organizational concept for all the governments in Eastern Europe, that continues on into the early 1990s. But the collapse of the Soviet Union really comes to fruition, and Americans begin to see that start to happen and unfold by 1989. So the biggest question is, well, wait a minute, how did we go from the Cold War, which was raging in various parts of the world through a number of different combat scenarios in places like Vietnam and Korea, of course, right? In places like Turkey and Greece, in places like Afghanistan. How is it that this decades-long conflict comes to a screeching halt? So there are a lot of reasons for this, and obviously I don't want to play this as if there is one easy explanation, because that would be incorrect, and I don't think that's helpful for you guys. On the other hand, this is not my class on history of American foreign relations, but since American foreign policy and military affairs, that's where I live and breathe, that's my research field, and that's in fact what I'm working on right now with my book that I'm feverishly trying to finish and submit to my publisher. So since that's the case, I should probably at least walk you through some elements of this, because I think it's pretty critical for you to understand. As American culture, is being broadcast around the world, this is one of the connections I wanted to start with you on. Part of that American pop culture broadcast, not only around our country but globally, that is a portion, it's a part of America's Cold War scenario, in the sense that the Reagan administration and subsequently the George H.W. Bush administration wanted to, really wanted to kind of thumb our noses at the Soviets and their allies and the communist principles and the communist way of life, which is obviously very different than the American way of life. The opportunities for Soviet citizens is significantly different than opportunities for Americans when it comes to things like food and clothing and pop culture and automobiles and whatever else. Very, very limited by comparison. Also, as you're well aware by now, think of all the restrictions in a closed society like the Soviet Union and all of the Eastern satellite countries in Europe. So, the ideological confrontation still exists, and part of that ideological confrontation is managed by broadcasting the highly enticing American culture to every part of the world that possibly can, where it can possibly be sent, especially to communist parts of the world. If Soviet citizens in Moscow or what have you are listening to Michael Jackson's Thriller and perhaps dressing a little bit like these pop stars or movie stars from the West, what does that say? Well, this is the idea. So even American pop culture is broadcast as, at some level, as a way of fighting the Cold War in a propaganda sense, and very effectively done, by the way. I mean, even now, if you go to other parts of the world, so much of it has been Americanized. Even those who don't want to acknowledge that would probably have to ruefully admit that that is true. But of course, it's much more than that. American Cold War strategy by the time of the Reagan administration was highly militarized. And very similar to what Eisenhower had done, the Reagan administration decides that in this weaponized format, the United States is going to kind of ratchet up the confrontation a little bit and push the Soviets, very, very clearly push the Soviets in their capacity to keep up with American military expansion. Most of the American military expansion was actually through the nuclear forces, the nuclear capabilities of the United States and its allies in NATO, of course. So that is first and foremost the priority. Upping the ante as far as the delivery packages for various missile systems. So there would be a whole slew of those to go through if you were graduate students or something. But suffice to say, whether it was something like the MX missile project or the tactical nuclear weapons versus the longer range strategic nuclear weapons, the MIRV delivery systems, the multiple independent reentry vehicle, what a fantastic acronym, right? MIRVs. The delivery systems for these missile packages, a lot more technological innovation being forced upon the nuclear arsenals. In addition, though, it is also true that America's conventional military forces were also ratcheted up significantly during the Reagan years. And a lot of this had to do with more, the higher tech components of America's conventional military forces. So the U.S. Air Force, obviously various weapons delivery packages in the form of aircraft. That would be the same with the United States Navy. And so these mechanisms are all important as far as sending a clear message that the United States is always prepared to push for its interests in the 1980s as opposed to the Soviet interests. The other element of this is that Reagan and his chief of staff, his national security advisor, Secretary of State, so the United States officials in the Reagan administration are pushing the Soviets, forcing them to keep up with American military growth, to see if they can keep pace with the American military buildup and with the nuclear forces. this is one of the key strategies of the Reagan administration. Now, some very crassly, carelessly say that the United States simply tried to outspend. It wasn't just about spending, although that is a portion of it. It was about um, innovation. It was about the various, not agencies like NASA are even part of this, right? So even the space shuttle program is incorporated into the Cold War strategy. But a lot of the industries, so a lot of the various companies that were getting government contracts during the Cold War, they're major innovators. Whether it's a country like a company like McDonnell Douglas, Northrop, Lockheed, what have you, and the Soviet system, of course, because it's state run, entirely state run, had a lot of problems keeping up. And the other element here is that the United States had the advantage of having unbelievable luck and success with its economic infrastructure in the 1980s, including its agricultural industry, which was pumping out, record numbers with crop production. The United States economy, by comparison, was booming. The entrepreneurial element here is really critical. All of this to say, the Reagan administration pushed the Soviets to the brink, and ultimately kind of held their feet to the fire with these kinds of strategies. Ultimately, it's really interesting that a lot of these hardliner Soviets gradually give way to some, relatively speaking, softliner guys like Gorbachev. Gorbachev comes to power in 1984, and almost immediately there is a change in the Soviet orientation with the Cold War. Now, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were never buddies. They were never really truly friends. I think that's a major exaggeration. But there was a level of initially mutual curiosity, then ultimately, I think, a level of mutual respect. But never mistake that if the United States by the mid 1980s, if the United States had not significantly pushed the Soviets into a very dangerous corner, I don't even think that Gorbachev would have come to power. But even if he had, I highly doubt that Gorbachev would have been willing to pursue the mediated positions that he sought, the willingness to engage in nuclear arms talks, the willingness to talk with President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher about vast changes and improvements between Soviet relations with the West. So yeah, this is all very important. The other thing that the Soviets are experiencing, by the way, in the 1980s is a long and destructive war in Afghanistan that many have likened to our experience in Vietnam, a very long, costly, destructive war in Afghanistan that, by the way, the United States was indirectly part of, because we were funding the Afghan rebels who were fighting against the Soviets. The CIA was actually helping to train them and arm them. Most famously, the Central Intelligence Agency is sending operatives to help the Mujahideen tribesmen in Afghanistan learn how to fire these shoulder-mounted rockets that were able to knock Soviet aircraft out of the sky and change the course of that war. All of this is happening as part of America's Cold War strategy in the 1980s. And man, what an unbelievably swift change this all brings. So the actions are also joined at the hip with a lot of very powerful rhetoric. So Ronald Reagan here, June the 12th, 1987 in Berlin. By the way, just as an aside, I was in Berlin on June the 12th. I was still living over in Europe, and my family and I traveled to West Germany at that time, and we were going on some trips through Europe. So I was actually in Berlin, although I was not at the speech. I just remember, seeing all the fanfare, and his address was broadcast, and we were literally about 4 or 5 miles away. I was just one of those interesting moments that I was there to be very close at hand when some of these things were happening. And this is the famous speech where Reagan tells Gorbachev to tear down the wall, tear down the Berlin Wall. Not only is he referring to that physical structure, but to tear down the wall between the West and the East, to tear down the wall of oppression, the Soviet communist oppression that had darkened the European continent for so long. So a very critical moment in time, to be sure. Here's a slide of Gorbachev and Reagan, and they met on a number of different summits over a period of years, and ultimately, as I said, I think they came to respect one another. By the way, so Gorbachev came when I was at the University of Nebraska doing my PhD work. Gorbachev was invited to speak, and I actually was able to go and listen to him and in his somewhat broken English. But since I speak no Russian, it was good that he at least spoke some English. So it was an interesting experience, and he admitted what this was about. This was in 2004, I believe. So he admitted to having this level of respect for Reagan, and he talked a little bit about the very difficult place the Soviet Union found itself in as a result of these very successful American economic and military strategic policies. So something to be aware of. The Iran-Contra scandal is, you know what, honestly, I'm not going to dig into that for you here too much. Unfortunately, this was a very poor decision by the Reagan administration. To this day, some of this stuff hasn't been fully declassified. But basically, this is about the United States trying to find stability in Latin America by funneling weapons through an illegal supply program overseen by Colonel Oliver North, who in some sense I think was the fall guy in the scenario, even though he was given quite a bit of carte blanche. He was given a lot of freedom to run this program. Reagan took a little bit of a black eye on this, but was not at the time, was not connected distinctly to making the decisions for the illegal shipments of arms, and claimed to be somewhat in the dark about the particulars. Again, a lot of this is still classified. We do know that Ronald Reagan was a little bit more aware of attempts to destabilize Central American governments, communist governments in Central America, through these kinds of weapons aid projects, which is obviously not something that Congress is usually overly interested in backing. So this is one of the scandals that broke in 1988, 1989, as Ronald Reagan was winding down as president. Reagan is famous for appointing Sandra Day O'Connor, a female justice, to the U.S. Supreme Court. I will say one of the great ironies of this appointment is he believed he was appointing this known, if not a fierce conservative, a very conservative justice to the U.S. Supreme Court. And once she was on the court, Ms. O'Connor actually typically was far more of a moderating presence. So she didn't really fulfill the role that Reagan thought she was going to, perhaps, but she had a good, prestigious career in the court, and she's definitely one of the important turning points as far as sexual politics are concerned when it comes to the United States Supreme Court. So somebody I just wanted you to be aware of in passing. So the other thing, hold on, there we go. The other thing I want to touch on, I'm actually going to talk about the Bush presidency when I get into the 1990s. So I'm going to come back. This is the first Bush presidency. George H.W. Bush becomes president in 1989. He'd served for 8 years as Reagan's vice president, and then is able to win election in 88 as Reagan is in the last stage of his presidential career. But 1989 is this critical year. American culture, as we've talked about here, has for Christians like me, I think it's fair to say we had our concerns about the massive materialism and hedonism. But one thing that no one in their right mind, at least at the time, no one in their right mind was comfortable with the Cold War going on in perpetuity for the foreseeable future. And when the signs of Soviet collapse began to emerge in 1988 and into the early months of 1989, no one probably really saw what was coming so quickly, but there were rumblings even by the early spring of 1989 that the Soviet system was in deep stress, and that one of the reasons that Gorbachev's government was reaching out so much to the West was because of their desperation. And I had been living in Europe, as some of you know. I've talked about it before. I've been living in Britain, and we came home in 1989 from having been over there for a while when my dad was doing research at Oxford and teaching at Oxford and also at St Andrews up in Scotland. And so I was not really a transplant, of course, because I'm from the States, but came back and saw this moment, and I got to tell you, the watching those European youth on the wall, on the Berlin Wall, watching all of these events unfold was one of the more interesting moments in my life, and it really did affect me. I mean, having been over there and living in Britain for a while, I'd at least had a recent association with the culture, but just understanding the levels of the Cold War and how it had infiltrated so much of life, seeing the youth on the Berlin Wall when only weeks and months prior they would have been ordered off the wall on pain of imprisonment or death, to see them all up there sledgehammering the wall to smithereens, to see this all happening right there at the Brandenburg Gate, to watch this was very moving. And I didn't realize how important it was until I came home from practice, and this was in the fall of 1989. I came home from practice that day, and there were my parents, and they were standing in our family room in our den in front of the television, watching the news coverage of the Berlin Wall being hammered and coming down. And they were both deeply moved and actually crying and holding hands. And I just remember, being kind of overwhelmed by that myself. I didn't, I knew it was important, but I think that just kind of brought it home for me. It was one of those really critical moments. So that's where I wanted to end for today. And we're obviously going to be moving into the 1990s and on into the 21st century as we go through the rest of the week. But that is my synopsis. I hope it kind of allows you to connect some dots about the decade of the 1980s, and we will be moving forward from here. Hope you're doing well, guys and gals. See ya.